You ever come across something out there that should already be finished but isn't? That was the thought running through my head that morning as I followed those faint tracks cutting through the dry pasture. Because a missing calf usually doesn't leave much behind after a night alone. Not in country where predators move quiet and fast and don't waste time once they've made a decision. The sun had barely cleared the low ridge to the east, casting that pale early light across the grass that still held a trace of cool from the night. And the land felt empty in that way it sometimes does, where sound doesn't carry quite right and even your own horse seems to step softer without knowing why. I'd picked up the trail just after first light, small hoof prints staggered and uneven, the kind that told you the calf had been separated from the herd and didn't quite know where it was going. And I followed it slow without rushing, because rushing doesn't change what you're going to find at the end of a track like that. And usually you expect silence to mean one thing, that it's already over. My gelding moved steady beneath me, ears flicking now and then as he read the ground the same way I was. Maybe better because horses don't second guess what they feel. They just react, and every now and then he'd hesitate for half a step before continuing. Like something ahead didn't sit right with him, even if he couldn't see it yet. The tracks led down into a shallow dip in the land. Nothing dramatic, just a slight lowering where the grass grew thinner and the soil showed through in patches. The kind of place water might collect after rain, though it had been dry long enough that everything there had taken on that brittle, dusty look. That was where I first saw movement. Not fast and not aggressive, just shapes shifting against the ground. And I slowed my horse without thinking, letting him come to a near stop as I leaned forward slightly and narrowed my focus on the dip below. Because something about the way those shapes moved didn't match what I expected to see. At that distance, I counted them one by one as they adjusted their positions. Realizing there were 6 in total, wolves spread out in a loose circle, and in the center of them stood the calf, alive, standing, and not moving, which alone was enough to make me sit still longer than I should have, because I'd seen what wolves do to a calf once they commit, and it isn't slow, it isn't hesitant, and it sure isn't quiet for long, but this was none of that. Because the wolves weren't attacking and they weren't even closing in, they were just holding their positions, each one spaced far enough apart to cover movement, heads low, ears forward, bodies angled inward toward the calf like they were waiting for something that hadn't happened yet. The calf stood there with its legs locked stiff and its sides barely moving, not even calling out the way a calf usually would when it's alone and scared. And that was the part that settled wrong in my chest before anything else. Because prey animals don't go quiet like that unless something has already broken inside them, or unless they're too confused to react at all. My horse shifted under me, weight moving from one front leg to the other, ears pinned forward and locked on the scene below. And I felt that same tight awareness settle into my gut, the kind that tells you this isn't just a simple predator situation anymore. I eased my rifle up slowly, not aiming yet, just bringing it into my hands while I watched, because the moment didn't call for panic, but it didn't allow for hesitation either. And when one of the wolves took a step forward and then stopped, while another adjusted its position slightly without committing, it became clear this wasn't a hunt and it wasn't a standoff either, but something in between, and that was the part that didn't make sense. I've watched wolves hunt before, and there's a rhythm to it once they've decided to move in. A shift you can see in their body language where hesitation disappears and everything becomes direct and purposeful. But what I was looking at down in that dip had none of that clarity. Just tension stretched thin across a moment that refused to break. The calf still hadn't moved. Not a step and not a sound. It just stood there with its eyes wide and fixed on nothing in particular, like it wasn't even tracking the wolves around it. And that was wrong in a way that's hard to explain unless you've spent enough time around livestock to know their instincts run deep and fast when danger gets close. My horse let out a low breath and shifted again, and I realized then that he wasn't just uneasy but holding himself back. muscles tight and ready to turn if something pushed too far. And that alone told me I needed to end whatever this was before it changed into something worse. But I didn't move right away. That was the part that stuck with me afterward, because I watched longer than I should have, and the longer I looked, the clearer it became that the wolves weren't unsure of the calf. They were unsure of something else entirely. Every now and then, one of them would lift its head slightly, not toward me and not toward the horizon, but toward the ground itself, like it was listening for something under the surface, something I couldn't hear or see, and then it would settle again. Still holding position and still waiting, the air felt heavier down there even from where I sat above it, like the space itself was holding something just out of reach of understanding. And I found myself tightening my grip on the rifle without realizing it. That was when I made the decision, not because the wolves moved, but because they didn't. And I nudged my horse forward just enough to get a clearer line before bringing the rifle up and sighting just above the group, not aiming to hit anything but to break whatever tension had settled over that dip before it turned into something I couldn't control. For a split second, everything held perfectly still, and then I fired. The crack of the rifle tearing through the morning and echoing off the low rise behind me as it rolled out across the pasture like a line drawn through silence. The reaction was immediate. All 6 wolves breaking at once, not scattering in confusion and not retreating in panic, but moving like they had been waiting for a signal, their bodies turning in perfect alignment as they slipped away from the circle and vanished into the brush beyond the dip with a speed that left nothing behind but disturbed grass and the fading echo of movement. It was too clean, too coordinated, and too fast for animals that had seemed so hesitant only seconds before. And then the calf bolted toward me without warning or build-up, going from frozen to running hard in an instant, its legs unsteady but driven by something that had finally snapped it out of whatever held it there. It reached me quickly and pressed close to my horse, sides heaving and breath coming fast and uneven. And I lowered the rifle slowly while my eyes kept scanning the edges of the dip where the wolves had disappeared. But nothing moved and nothing watched, even though the feeling didn't leave. Because whatever had kept them there was gone now. I led the calf back slowly without pushing it, letting it settle into a pace it could manage while my horse kept glancing back over his shoulder more than usual, ears working at sounds I couldn't pick up. And the whole way back across that pasture felt longer than it should have, like the distance had stretched without reason. By the time we reached the herd, the sun had climbed higher and burned off the last of the cool air, bringing the day into something that felt more normal and grounded. But that didn't shake what I had seen, and when I checked the calf over, I expected to find something that explained it, a wound or a weakness, anything that would justify why 6 wolves would surround it without finishing the job. But there was nothing beyond the usual signs of stress and fatigue. No blood, no injury, nothing that marked it as different from any other calf in that pasture. And that left me with a question I couldn't answer. Because wolves don't hesitate without reason, and they don't waste energy holding position unless something in the situation doesn't add up. And whatever that something was, it hadn't been the calf. I rode back out to that dip later that afternoon, alone this time, following the same path down into the low ground where the grass still showed signs of where they had stood. Faint impressions where paws had pressed into the soil, the circle still visible if you knew what you were looking for. I dismounted and walked the area slowly, scanning the ground and the edges and the surrounding brush, looking for anything that might have changed the way those wolves behaved. And at first there was nothing but dry soil, scattered grass, and still air. Then I noticed something subtle and easy to miss. The ground near the center of that circle felt different under my boots. Not soft exactly, but hollow in a way that didn't match the rest of the pasture, like the layer beneath had shifted or settled over time. I crouched down and pressed my hand against it, feeling for movement or vibration, anything that might explain what I couldn't see. And for a brief moment, just a second or two, I thought I felt something faint, like a distant shift beneath the surface. Something that wasn't quite solid, but it stopped as quickly as it started. And just like that, I understood enough to stop digging. Not everything out there needs to be explained all the way down to its root. And some things you recognize for what they are and leave alone. I stood up, brushed the dust from my hands, and took one last look at that dip before heading back. And as I rode away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the wolves hadn't been watching the calf. They had been watching the ground or whatever was under it. And whatever it was had been enough to make 6 experienced predators hesitate. Out here, that means something because it means there are parts of the land that don't behave the way you expect. Places where instinct overrides hunger and where even animals that live by the rules of survival decide it's better to wait than to act. I still pass that stretch of pasture now and then, and every time I do, I give that dip a little more distance than I used to. Not out of fear, but out of respect for something I don't fully understand. Because if wolves decide something isn't right, that's usually reason enough. And that was the day I learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing out there isn't what you can see coming at you, but what makes everything else stop and wait.